Today we're going to be creating a Give Thanks painting that you can create any time of the year, but I thought it was especially great for this time of year. We're going to be using Prang's canvas panels. The size I'm using is a 9 by 12. Prang sells these canvas panel packs in a pack of 3. We'll also be using tempera paint. You could swap out for acrylic paint if that's something that you have on hand. I'll also be using a paintbrush, a piece of chalk to draw my design, and an ink-filled bingo dauber. That's what I'll be using to write the letters. Now, if you don't have a bingo dauber, don't worry. You could simply draw your lines and designs in chalk like I'm going to do, and then instead of using an ink-filled bingo dauber, you can simply use black paint. So let's start by grabbing that canvas panel or a sheet of paper if that's what you have, and a piece of chalk, and let's get started. Let's begin with our canvas panel or a piece of paper, making sure to position it so that it's going horizontally. I'm going to use a piece of chalk because it's easy to erase. You could use a pencil if that's what you happen to have. Begin by drawing a line from one side in the middle to the other side in the middle, making the line a little bit curved. Now on the top portion of the canvas, I'm going to write the word give, and I'm going to make sure that the letters are capitalized and that they touch the top of the canvas and stretch all the way down to that curved line. It's important that the letters start at the top of the canvas and stretch all the way down to that curved line. Now, almost all of my letters are going to be capitalized. I decided, though, to make my E lowercase. Now, for the lower part of the canvas, I'm going to write the word thanks. For this, I'm going to again stretch my letters. The top of the letter will be positioned at the top of that curved line, and then the letters have to stretch all the way down to the bottom of the canvas. I want my letters to be capitalized, stretching from that curved line all the way down to the bottom of the canvas. And the reason is because I am creating shapes with my lines that I will later be able to paint in different colors. Now, if you happen to make your letters maybe a little bit too big and you didn't quite make enough room, that's why we're using chalk. Then it's easy to erase and change. Once you have your letters created, you can either use black paint, or I'm using a little marker that's called a bingo dauber that I've filled with permanent ink, and I'm simply tracing over my chalk lines slowly and carefully. I'm not squeezing that marker bottle. You don't need to. The ink will flow out of it easily. I'm not shaking it because it could splatter permanent ink, and I'm definitely not slamming it down on my canvas. I'm drawing very slowly and very carefully going over my chalk lines and making sure that if I feel like the lines are maybe not as thick as I want them to be, or maybe the ink was a little bit scratchy, I can just slowly go over those letters one more time. So here I'm making sure that as I trace, my letters stretch all the way from the top to the bottom, whether that be the top of the canvas to the bottom of the curve line, or like here on thanks, to the top of the curve line to the bottom of the canvas. Notice I'm going slowly and carefully so I can really stay on my lines. And now I want you to also notice that I've been able to create a bunch of shapes. Each one of these shapes that I've created, I'm going to paint a different color. Now I noticed that the ink took a while to dry on my canvas, and it's important that you let the ink dry completely before you paint. Otherwise, the ink will mix with the paint and give you colors that you might not be thrilled with. So let it dry completely. How will you know when it's dry? When you touch the black ink, it won't make your finger dirty. Now, if you end up painting it with tempera paint or acrylic paint, it should dry pretty quickly. Let's go over those steps one more time. The first step was to draw a curved line from one side of your horizontal paper to the other side, and then make sure that your letters stretch from the top of your paper or your canvas to that curved line. Again, it's a good idea to draw with something like chalk. If you do draw something you're not happy with, a tissue is the best way to erase the chalk. You won't want to use your hand. It'll just end up smearing on the paper and making a mess on your fingers. So instead, try using a tissue. It also might help to practice this on a dry erase board. What I noticed was that the word give is a short word. The word thanks is a longer word. So you need to give yourself some more space for the word thanks, and you can spread the letters out a little bit more for the word give. Practicing on a dry erase board might help you plan where your letters are going to go. Once you have your letters mapped out, that's again when you can grab either some black paint or your paint marker, and you can trace over those letters. But we already know how to do this part, so let's go ahead and speed this up and then talk about painting. The kind of paint that I'm going to be using today is tempera paint. You could also use a kind of paint like, if this is done on a piece of paper, you could use watercolor paint or even tempera cakes. But if you've done your artwork on a canvas, the best kind of paint to use would be tempera paint, which I will be using, or acrylic paint. You'll also need a cup of water, and I like to use a sponge to clean my brush, but you could use something like a paper towel, and you'll also need some paintbrushes. My favorite paintbrush to use for this was a paintbrush that's called a flat brush because it has a nice pointy tip and flat bristles for scooping up quite a bit of paint. Now, sometimes when you're painting, you might notice that you've got some areas that are really narrow and hard to paint within. So here's a suggestion for you. Get a couple of different kinds of paintbrushes. When my artists paint, I tell them to get little brushes for little jobs and a big brush for a big job. And then as you're painting, look at the area where you're going to paint. Is it a little area? Well, then that's a job for your little brush. Is it a wide area like this right here? Then that's a job for a wider brush. Notice that when I get close to my letters, I don't want to paint over them, so I slow down. I'm using what's called a flat brush, and it can be rotated a little bit, and it goes really well inside some small spaces, but it does help to really slow it down. Now, how do you know what to paint? Well, remember we were talking about creating shapes? I'm looking for shapes as I paint. I noticed I had a half circle or a semicircle shape where the E was, so I painted that shape one color. And then I noticed I had a triangle where the letter A was, so I decided to paint that. Those two shapes, because I can recognize them and name them, those are geometric shapes. But then I had this interesting shape that went around the E, and I decided to paint that yellow. Now that shape is not a geometric shape because I can't give it a name. That shape is an organic shape, and so I'm going to fill all of that shape in with one color. The more colorful you make your painting, the more interesting it will be to look at. But to make sure that it stays nice and colorful, it's important that you clean your paintbrush. So before I change to a different shape and use a different color, I'm going to clean my brush. Now, when I clean my brush, I don't just dip my paintbrush in the water. I have to give my paintbrush a bath. That means I put it in the water and I scrub the bristles at the bottom of the water cup. And then I dry my paintbrush off by drawing an X on a sponge. If you have a sponge, you could do the same. But if you don't have a sponge, then you can use something like a paper towel. Anything to get that drippy, dirty water off of your brush because you don't want that to get on your beautiful painting. So let's clean this brush off and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm scrubbing at the bottom of my water cup and now I'm drawing an X on my sponge to get all that dirty water off before finding another color to use and looking for a shape. So look for those shapes and think about all of the different colors that you can use in your painting. Now let's talk about what kinds of colors you might want to use for your painting. I like really bright colors, so I'm using all of my favorite bright colors for my painting, trying to use a different color each time so that no two colors that are the same are next to one another. But you could also do colors like for the fall, perhaps red, orange, yellow, and green like fall leaves might be beautiful for a give thanks painting. Or what if you picked one color but changed that color somehow? Meaning if you picked blue and painted some parts blue, but then added white to make it light so it had light blue in it, or added black to make it dark so it had darker blue in it, creating a completely blue painting. A painting that has one color throughout is called monochromatic. That might be interesting too. You could take a little scrap piece of paper and test some different colors out to see what colors you really like and which ones you think might look good for your painting. No matter what, I know what you create will be amazing. The only thing that I had to watch out for was sometimes I painted over my black lines, so that told me I needed to slow down a little bit when I got close to those so that didn't happen. But here's the trick. If you accidentally paint over some of your black lines once your painting is dry, completely dry, you can go back with black paint, whether it be on your paintbrush or in your ink-filled bingo dauber, and trace over those little spots, hiding any places where you accidentally painted over the words "give thanks." Now that I'm getting closer to being finished with my painting, I'm working on those smaller shapes, which means I'm probably going to have to switch to my smaller paintbrush. Now that I'm almost finished with my painting, I'm beginning to think about what other paintings I could make on my other 2 canvas panels. Remember, the praying pack comes in a pack of 3, which means I've got 2 more to do. I could create 2 more give thanks paintings and use these as gifts or presents. The choice is yours because after all, you are the artist. And like I said, you could even create this on a sheet of paper. No matter what you do, no matter what art supplies you use, I know your give thanks painting will be amazing. But most of all, I hope that you had fun. Toodles!